Welcome to Second Take, the show that focuses on the issues behind the news. Triple-listed Coal of Africa Limited says a national debate is needed to discuss ways of lowering the high cost of railing bulk commodities like coal. Mining Weekly editor Martin Creamer tells us more. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks, Shannon.
Coal CEO David Brown says the costs of logistics are twice the costs of mine and processing costs in South Africa. What are the solutions to this problem?
Well, as far as public enterprises go, Transnet is probably doing better than most. We have Eskom is in trouble at the moment with high tariffs. And Transnet, although it's seen to be efficient, it's a very expensive tariff. And we've heard this often. The stories that have been getting around for years, that it costs you more to rail goods from Joburg to Durban than it does to ship them from Durban to Beijing, or it just seems totally out of kilter.
Yeah.
And now what David Brown is saying, it's also out of kilter with mining costs. It's costing him like 200 Rand a ton to mine and process the coal, but it's costing him 400 Rand a ton to transport it. And the big element of that transport is the rail cost. Now we know that this is what happens with monopolies. Now, state-owned monopolies, we can see the tariffs of Eskom, rising. They come under scrutiny more because consumers are all over the place using electricity, so they feel it. And of course, the municipalities also push the price up very high, so people feel that electrical shock. But with rail tariffs, it's not as felt by the ordinary individual, but it is felt by the bigger companies that have to use this. Now, when it comes to big companies, Coal of Africa Limited is not a big company, it's still a junior miner, but it's got plans that are very interesting for South Africa and strategic for South Africa. And it dovetails, with a steel plant that's coming into focus in Limpopo. And the government has had this ambition to have low steel costs. Coal of Africa Limited can help with that by supplying, the lower input costs. But it's already doing its sums and finding that even to move the coal around internally, not actually to export it, on the general freight line, when you move your coal around, it is very expensive. And what David Brown is saying, look, is we should sit down as a country and work out what is strategic about rail. It's hugely strategic. And the fact that it's a monopoly that runs it, there also has to be some sort of benchmarking. Transnet must benchmark against the rest of the world and must come into line. We know that with the manganese railing to Port Elizabeth, BHP Billiton actually brought out Australians to do a benchmarking exercise. And they were actually prepared to help Transnet come into line with international best practice. But it just never got off the ground. And that is the sort of offer that we cannot turn down any longer. It's key that Transnet, which is showing a lot of liveliness, comes into line with its charges for its rail services.
Now, tell us more about state rail company Transnet's take-or-pay arrangements, one of which was signed with BHP Billiton Energy Coal this week.
See, it's a fairly common thing that these rail owners, they want to take or pay. So if they arrive there with their trains, they want you to fill that train. They don't want you to say, look, we've got no coal this week, come back next week, because that's very costly. So this can create a lot of efficiency, and we see that BHP Billiton and Transnet, which were fighting each other, have now kissed and made up. And we saw this 25 billion or 24 billion Rand deal over 10 years signed. And this is with BHP their coal assets, which of course they're going to be spun off. They're going to be spun off from BHP itself. But even after spin-off, that will still be binding. They made it clear. It's a take-or-pay arrangement, so then if Transnet doesn't arrive at the right time, at the scheduled contracted time, that enterprise, state-owned or not, also gets financially penalized. So there are penalties for the take and pay. So it makes for efficiency, and it also makes for knowing what your revenue is going to be, over the long term. So in view of that long vision of revenue, I think Transnet are in a better position to start sharpening their pencils and coming down with much better rates. They must come into line, I believe, with global best practice. They must be benchmarked against comparable rail sites, and they need to meet those targets. So with this take or pay, they're going to go around to many more mining companies. This is the first one, with BEXA, BHP Billiton's coal operation. They will then see more than 20 others, and obviously they're going to be pushing for signatures. And if you don't come into line, well, it's more risky for the operations. They won't have any transport, and coal mining and bulk mining is all about transport. Never mind the mining, it's all about the logistics. And we see that the port logistics, they're not worried, they're not complaining about. They're saying that's a much smaller percentage. It's the rail that of those logistic costs, it goes up to 70% of the cost. They want that brought down, and I think it's in the national interest. If you want an economy to move, you must do this sort of thing. You can't say this is a state-owned enterprise and going to operate in isolation. It must look at the strategic picture of the country, and hopefully, they'll come to an arrangement where they can sit down and talk, so that we don't lose out on some projects that might not be able to go ahead if the rail tariffs are too high.
Would Coal of Africa Limited be willing to sign a take-or-pay agreement?
Yes. They had no objection to the take-or-pay agreement in principle.
Okay.
What they worried about is the high cost of rail, because in a way it disciplines both parties.
Yeah.
And they also need to be disciplined, and they want that discipline so they can get their coal out. So in principle they're saying yes, although we do find a lot of resistance in the private sector. Of course, the private sector wants it both ways. It wants its coal delivered, but if it hasn't got the coal, it doesn't want to pay for that delivery. But it is a two-way street, and they're starting to go along that route now, and it will be for the better.
Now, moving ahead with the Coal of Africa's plans on building a Mikado plant that will start being constructed in 2016, what impact will that have on the surrounding community?
The community impacts are positive. It's always jobs. It's always helping the communities. These days you'll find that mining companies go out of their way to help near-mine communities. They'll help them with medical issues, educational issues, logistics issues, and water issues. Often they bring water to the community. It's always positive. And now the communities themselves also look for jobs. And we're talking about 2,200 jobs and then 1,100 jobs permanently, 2,200 during the construction phase. Not huge. I'm not saying this is a massive company, but if you create an enabling environment, you'll get a lot more of that. And they are in a very sweet spot in South Africa, because within the Soutpansberg and within this Limpopo area is very valuable hard coking coal. Now, hard coking coal is very strategic for South Africa at the moment. If they do want to increase the steel manufacture, as they're saying they do, the state-owned, again, Industrial Development Corporation, signed a memorandum of agreement with the Chinese company to put up a new steel plant there. They will want inputs as close as possible, because it means that you can benefit from the proximity. But if you're going to benefit from proximity, a 100-kilometer radius, you need the rail tariffs to be down, otherwise there's not going to be. So I'm sure there could be a meeting of the minds here, because that Mikado project, it's 5 billion rand, it's about 450 million, or up to $450 million. So that's what they're planning to mine, that hard coking coal, which is needed. It's not the coal that you burn. It's not the thermal coal. They will have thermal coal as well for Eskom, but it's the hard coking coal that's needed for steel manufacture. And in this point, it's something that the government is looking for South Africa to go in that direction. And if it is, it needs to also be an enabler to see that the logistics are in place for it.
Well, thank you very much, Martin.
Great pleasure, Shannon.
That's it for this week. Join us again next time for more news analysis on South Africa's mining industry.
The government has had this ambition to have low steel costs. Coal